About 90%, or maybe 80%. In my experience, most public schools in most urban districts are Title I schools. That means there's a high concentration of poverty, therefore the school is eligible for federal Title I funding that is supposed to be used as supplemental aid to support the less fortunate students. When you look at this slide, the green schools at the top represent the ratio of schools that are not designated Title I. These schools are mostly high-quality magnet schools that are very selective, and affluent families often have an inside track. The red schools represent the ratio of schools that are designated as Title I, and that's a lot. One of my favorite books is Unequal Childhoods by Annette LaRue. LaRue uses qualitative data to show us how two dominant parent rearing styles influence class and how individuals interact with power. In this episode, we're going to tackle the question, how did social class influence our approach to reopening schools during the pandemic? At least here in Tennessee, because I think it did. First, there's concerted cultivation. Concerted cultivation is a parenting style that involves upper middle class parents actively engaging in their children's lives to nurture their talents and skills. In rearing children this way, children have schedules and structured activities. They are taught to use language for negotiations and for serving their own interest. When it comes to intervening in a child's school, parents are quick to criticize the school and to intervene on behalf of the child. The child, in turn, learns to do the same. It's an expectation. Thus, the awful stories you hear when a child actually earns a C on a paper, but parents advocate for an A. Additionally, it is the parent's upper middle class status or even rich status that makes this kind of advocacy possible. You see, unconsciously, their power can intimidate the teacher whose annual income and social status is a fraction of the parents. And so, yeah, that child gets an A. As a consequence of all this, many of these children develop a sense of entitlement and mimic their parents. It makes you wonder why many of these people would never even consider being a teacher for a profession or encouraging their children to be a teacher, because they don't respect the profession. Although it's not explicitly stated in the book, the social network of this class is a form of wealth and power. We'll explore that more on the next slide. But if you want to do a little extra homework, Google the term elite theory to help you out. Now, for working class folks, parents approach child rearing through accomplishment of natural growth. The accomplishment of natural growth is a child rearing philosophy that involves allowing a child to grow up spontaneously while providing love, care, and some limits. Language is not a tool of negotiation. Instead, children are seen but not heard, and the child accepts directives and is taught not to challenge adults or authorities. Parents are dependent on the expertise and opinions of institutions such as schools, governments, and doctors. There's a real sense of powerlessness and a dependence on luck. There are very few professionals to serve as role models. And as a consequence of this kind of rearing, the character of these kids can be very constrained and small. And then they become adults who may also become dependent on experts and institutions. Moreover, navigating the labyrinth of a bureaucracy or the upper middle class network can be difficult, but not impossible. There are good people everywhere who want to help. Churches are often great communities because they can be as diverse as you imagine. Economically diverse, racially diverse, and more. So there's exposure to how different people interact in different networks and professions. The same could be said for schools in small rural communities. And communities are different than networks. Networks exchange information and opportunities for personal gain. And if you are perceived to have nothing to give, you become obsolete. Positional power is often the currency you have to use. So let's see how this affected the school openings of 2021. Here's a tale of two districts. This district is the one I live in. It's where my youngest went to school. She was a high schooler in 2021. As we learned previously, adults within this economic class have power and they know how to use it. There's some sense of entitlement. And here's my take. Districts like these may have had pressure to open up because some of the parents might just withdraw their kids from the school and send them to a private school because there were a good number of private schools that actually stayed open. Losing students would be bad for this district because losing students equals lost revenues. So it's less of a headache for the district to open with the option of distance learning and regular brick and mortar education. I would drop my daughter off every morning and then I would come home and jump on Zoom to observe online classrooms and take meetings. I felt awful. Now, the schools I manage were in this district. We tried many opening options, but like many schools, we hid behind the district decision to stay closed. Remember, many of the families that attend public schools in this district are in the lower socioeconomic class, where most schools are Title I. They tend to believe the experts. Therefore, if the media and district officials say it's unsafe, then it's unsafe. Families whose child-rearing approach is accomplishment of natural growth, according to LaRue, don't often question these experts who make these decisions. That's how they've been conditioned, especially if individuals do not belong to a strong community like a church or a family. They also feel powerless, frustrated, and they can't stand being dependent on the powers that be. Now, while I think the elitist educational network, which I was once a part of, has good intentions, there are unintended consequences. Most board members are made of some of the most powerful people in the city. They're from an elite network and are connected to other elite nonprofits or consulting groups. I don't want to say they get something out of making decisions for others, treating them as children, wanting to help them, right? Because that would be a judgment on my part. But I do think they may get a little jolt of that heroism high, that they may feel a little bit superior, because power is a drug. Some of these folks don't even send their own kids to public schools. Now, as for myself, as I said, I felt like a hypocrite and I felt ashamed. We also need to consider the power dynamics in the elections, where promises are made and terms are short. Now, if it weren't for the governor, I'm almost certain the schools would have remained closed in the urban districts for the entirety of the 2021 academic year. So let's summarize. The heroic, well-intended treatment of Title I schools isn't just applicable to the pandemic. It's in many of the decisions. Why? Because the powerful and elite want to help, but they may not believe people of the lower strata are smart enough or enlightened enough to make their own decisions. They've been infantilized. This attitude also applies to programmatic choices because the less affluent believe the experts and institutions while also believing they are powerless against power. Now, does this power dynamic cause gaps, and are those gaps lucrative to consultants? You betcha. Just look at this chart again. And it's also responsible for a lot of the bad programmatic choices. Think back to the panic of No Child Left Behind. Many Title I schools opted into the America's Choice model for literacy that did nothing for phonics. And guess what? Those schools are still failing. Or think about the lowering of standards by insisting kids need brain breaks because they can't sit still for longer than 10 minutes. Many parents know better than this. They take their kids to church and they sit just fine. But trust the experts, right? Or think about how charter schools and districts hire parent organizers to embolden parents for participating in policy and advocacy. Or how to get out the vote. All you need is a few pizzas and buses to pack parents into school board meetings to advocate and intimidate for policies that favor an organization, not the kids. You can do the same thing for voting booths. Heck, I've seen it done a million times. Were there any courage gaps and solutions? Absolutely. Here are some of the courage gaps. Obviously, we lack courage to stay open. Now, if we are leading schools with high poverty rates, we ought to consider socioeconomic child-rearing differences and deeply reflect on our own intentions. Is this a job or a service or a way to flex status and feel heroic? And if you do lead a high poverty school, why not visit a school in an affluent community with the parents of your school and your staff and even some of your students? Then ask if your school is delivering the same level of programming. Because remember, the courage gap is the only gap that consultants cannot fix. You need to get loud when necessary, because the last few years there have been people who've been self-censoring and there have been other people who have brought bad ideas into education. The potential to change K-12 is hidden in your silence, and now it's time to talk.